Welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley speaking to you from Washington, D.C. Now, this week we're going to have to delve deeply into U.S. domestic politics. And in particular, we're going to be showcasing Bishop Romney and his tradition. I hope you'll be looking at Tarpley.net. I always hope you look at Tarpley.net and indeed Webster G. Tarpley Twitter feed, but Tarpley.net, within a week or 10 days before the Republican convention starts, I believe, we're going to have a possibility for you to get the kind of report that I'm putting together. Think of it as a kind of a special report on Romney and his tradition. Bishop Romney, I should say. He is a bishop, a Mormon bishop, and he has a tradition. Does he ever? And we have to look into the cultural, ideological matrix that this represents. Where does this guy come from? This is how we can tell what he's likely to do. Tradition is destiny. Biography is destiny, to some extent. Actually, we always have free will. But in general, when you're dealing with these low-grade subjects, like Obama and Romney, biography and tradition and connections are very much their destiny. So we are going to look at this in some detail. Now, our attention in terms of the organizing perspective remains fixed on the campaign to stop austerity. And you can simply see this in the campaign now. The ruling class in general is building up to an orgy of genocidal austerity. Ron Paul did yeoman service. He was the point man. He was a kind of a shockwave out in front of everything. Ron Paul's yeoman service is to make reactionary to fascist economics presentable, that you can discuss them, that you're not laughed out as a crank and a crackpot, which would be one way, or you're not sent to Nuremberg to face charges, which is what happened to people who actually did these things back in the 1930s and 1940s. So we want to focus on Romney, but we're doing this also because we want to get this anti-austerity resistance front going, the national anti-austerity committees, the New Deal coalitions. There's a conference quite possibly in the works for, quite possibly, again, New York City, quite possibly in late September or October. There's a website that will also cast light on this issue, specifically devoted to the organizing of this. So that's the general framework, and we'll refer back to this austerity issue as we go through what's actually happening. The first thing you have to understand is the ruling class wants Romney. This is fundamental. One of the first questions you have to ask yourself, as we did 4 years ago with Obama, who is the ruling class backing? This right now may not be so clear as it was with Obama. And in the case of Obama, it was an overwhelmingly clear choice by the ruling class in favor of Obama. But that was then. This is now. I see a lot of people who are normally rather judicious who are fighting the last war. People who are devoting 100% of their time to attacking Obama, I think, are being very, very foolish, and they are fighting the last war, right? This used to be said of the French army. They were always ready for the previous conflict, and that's the way you lose the current one. We don't need to go into too much detail on that, but don't fight the last war. We know all about Obama. I wrote 2 books about Obama. I'm second to none in opposition to Obama. I did everything I could when that would have yielded results. I tried to spare the world from the ordeal of Obama. That was then. This is now. And now you have a new, brutal, genocidal enemy typified by the Paul Ryan vice presidential nomination. But just the question of the ruling class. How do we know that the ruling class is for Romney? 2 things. The first thing is you can now see that in terms of Wall Street contributions and other fat cat, plutocrat money contributions, Romney is pulling ahead. That's number one. Normally, a sitting president would always be ahead, but not in the case of the asset stripper, hedge fund hyena, corporate raider and Wall Street bandit Romney, deeply rooted in a tradition of Mormon financial flim-flam that we'll go through. One of the Mormon traditions is counterfeiting. The accusations, according to many sources, the accusations of counterfeiting were about as frequent as the accusations of polygamy against the Mormons. So with the Mormons, you've got a religion, not just of polygamy, but also of counterfeiting in terms of what they actually did. The campaign contributions are going to Romney. Even more important, in terms of a political indicator, the Federal Reserve is doing nothing to help Obama, and that means they're helping Romney. Normally a president would call up Bernanke and say, look, I want you to inject $500 billion of liquidity, right? Let's get a little pop going here, right? Let's sort of goose the economy and see if we can't get a mild upturn in September or October. It's probably too late for that now. It still might be attempted. But all that stuff from Bernanke about how he stands ready to take action if unemployment remains too high. Well, unemployment has been too high for 4 years, Ben. Get out of your helicopter. And that was what was behind that exchange between Chucky Schumer and Helicopter Ben at the last Humphrey Hawkins hearings in the Senate. Schumer said to Bernanke very pointedly, Mr. President of the Board of Governors, or whatever his title is, unemployment is very high. Yeah, said Bernanke. Get to work, said Schumer. Get to work means give us QE3, give us $500 billion, start buying U.S. government securities. Let's get a little bit of momentum. Right? This is not a recovery. This is just an uptick in the context of the Depression, but they can do that. And the fact that they don't do it shows that the ruling class wants Romney. So if you're giving Romney a free ride, if you're giving Romney a free pass and concentrating everything on Obama, you're in danger of being a dupe of that same ruling class that brought you Obama. You've got to understand it is the reversal of the ideological fields on the part of the ruling class that the average person can't keep up with. If you want to be a leader, you better learn to keep up with it. Now, let's get to Paul Ryan. The purpose of, we said Ron Paul, right? Ron Paul's candidacy is to make extreme reactionary, or indeed fascist, right? Schachtian, there's no other way to put it. The economics of Hjalmar Schacht, the economics that leads to a concentration camp, because that's the ultimate logic of it. Super austerity, well, what's the most extreme austerity? The most extreme austerity is a concentration camp. So once you're on the austerity bandwagon and the $1 trillion in cuts, well, where does that lead? It leads to someplace rather ugly. The purpose of some of these candidacies is to make this kind of economics, Schachtian economics, presentable, that it can be debated in polite society, rather than laughed out as crackpot or outright fascist. Now, in the case of Paul Ryan, we have what I would call Ron Paul light, in the sense that he wants savage, genocidal austerity cuts, but he does it as a young guy and smiling and supposedly reasonable. Now, in reality, he is an extremist. This is a reactionary. This is a thug. This is an exterminator of the American people who wants to become vice president. His plan, of course, for Medicare, you're going to get a voucher. The voucher will be worth a few $1,000s. If you need a medical procedure that costs more than the voucher and you haven't got the money to make up the difference, too bad. It was nice knowing you. You are dead. And with Social Security, privatize it, which, of course, means a bonanza in terms of commissions for Wall Street brokers and other parasites. That's the essence of Paul Ryan. And watch out for that widow's peak. The widow's peak is an omen that somebody's going to die. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Keep up with all of this at Tarpley.net, Webster G. Tarpley Twitter feed. Let's look at Paul Ryan, fascist economist, because he is. What is his ideological matrix? What is the structure, the institutional historical structure that underlies this Republican ticket of Romney and Ryan? Well, Romney, of course, we know, a bishop of the Mormon Church, right, a Freemasonic religious formation. You look at Paul Ryan, the betting here is that he's also a Freemason. But the one thing we know for sure is this is a Republican politician from the state of Wisconsin. And in modern times, to be a Republican politician from the state of Wisconsin, you have got to reflect the views of the infamous and much mocked John Birch Society. The Birchers, the John Birch Society. They were mocked, of course. They deserve to be mocked. They are an obscenity. They are a parody of themselves. That would be Bob Dylan's song about the paranoid John Birch Society, the Chad Mitchell Trio, Dr. Strangelove, right? The guy who's obsessed with his precious bodily fluids is supposed to be a General Jack Ripper. Of course, he's a figure for the Birchers. The John Birch Society were the people who were so extreme that they said General Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, is a conscious agent of the world communist conspiracy, right? Lunacy. But what was considered an obscene joke in the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s is now knocking on the door of power in the person of Paul Ryan. Now, what does that have to do with Mormondom? Simply this, that the John Birch Society over the years has become more and more a kind of satellite of the Mormons. This is a kind of a political front sponsored by various groups of Mormons. Examples, Ezra Taft Benson was the Mormon representative in Eisenhower's cabinet. He served 8 years as Secretary of Agriculture, trying to undo the various New Deal reforms. Ezra Taft Benson then became the top honcho, the first president of the Mormon Church. He encouraged people to support the John Birch Society. Ezra Taft Benson, top Mormon, loves the John Birch Society. You know, it got to the point where it became embarrassing. They had to take a step back in 1963. One of the embarrassing points was the John Birch Society was out there saying Eisenhower is a commie, and Ezra Taft Benson, who owed his cabinet post to Eisenhower made the mistake of making him great. So he's basically supporting a group that slanders the president, his own boss. Kind of duplicity that we'll get to, we'll find frequently in these analyses. So that's one side of it. In the middle of the Aughties, right around 05, 06, you had a Mormon president of the John Birch Society, and you find things on the internet about how that guy purged non-Mormons and packed the structure, the bureaucracy of the John Birch Society with Mormons. Their headquarters, by the way, is in Appleton, Wisconsin, reactionary capital of at least part of the world. But here's the big thing. Cleon Skousen, Mormon, big Mormon, and at the same time, the top ideologue of the John Birch Society. Even though he claimed that he was not a member, at least most of the time, Cleon Skousen is the personal union of Mormondom. In many ways, he's the most famous Mormon writer, or he's one of the most famous Mormon writers, at least of those years, now departed. Cleon Skousen is the top ideologue of the John Birch Society. And these are books like The Naked Capitalist. This is the guy who coined a term which I've always disliked intensely, the New World Order. It's not new. It's not world. It's Anglo-American imperialism. And, of course, it's not an order. It's chaos, and that's not order. His nephew, Joel Skousen, writes about survivalism. And I noticed there's a radio broadcast of Stan Monteith with Joel Skousen, which they devote to your humble servant. And naturally, I'm flattered by so much slanderous attention. And, of course, the accusation is that I'm a socialist. You can see the John Birch Society, right? Standard John Birch Society, you don't like something, they're a commie. There's a commie under the bed. They're all commies but thee and me, and I'm not so sure of thee. John Birch Society. So Skousen says, I'm a socialist or a closet socialist. This is all ridiculous. I represent the American system of political economy. I am an American system traditionalist. I don't go for foreign doctrines like Austrianism. I don't go for foreign doctrines or anti-American doctrines like Mormonism, which is a separate nation. So Cleon Skousen, Joel Skousen, Mormondom. There you see why Romney finds it congenial. Somehow the stuff is all the news pundits say Romney finds the chemistry with Ryan so congenial. He likes so much to go out on the stump with Paul Ryan. Well, there it is, because they have this ideological basis. It's very interesting the way these choices get made. It seems to be a pragmatic political calculation made indeed in the heat of the moment, but it actually reflects institutional alliances that go back decades. I mean, you could see that one of the clearest examples in recent U.S. history, and it's written up, by the way, in George H.W. Bush, The Unauthorized Biography, 1992. We had the 20th anniversary of that last month. In the case of the George Bush the Elder cabinet, in order to get into that cabinet, the best credential was to have a multi-decade, multi-generational alliance between your family and the Bush family. That's how you got, to be ambassador or White House official, or indeed some of the cabinet posts. Makes for a very narrow nepotistic kind of approach. But you can see this now with Ryan and with Romney. Okay, so this is the John Birch Society, which itself is a satellite of Latter-day Saints, Mormon Church. Now let's look at some of the policy stuff. We said Romney-Ryan would destroy Medicare, destroy Social Security. That's genocide right there. That's a one-way ticket to Nuremberg. Romney, to muddy the waters, says Obama wants to cut Medicare by $716 billion. Now, that figure is pulled out of the air. That means that is drawn, it's a kind of an inference drawn from a government report. The reality is Obama cuts $500 billion from Medicare, and he cuts it from the providers. In other words, he says, I'll leave your individual benefits alone, but I will carve it out of the hide of hospitals and doctors. Now, that's very bad, but remember, under the U.S. system, money has to be authorized and then it has to be appropriated, right? Everything goes through twice. Many people still don't get it. Under the actual budget process, generally there's a doc fix, meaning that the $500 billion is what Obama wants to cut. But when it comes to the actual Congress, they may, as they did this year, institute a doc fix, which would roll that back. Bad enough. So, back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. So, Paul Ryan, Matrix, John Birch Society, top ideologue, Cleon Skousen, Mormon. You get the idea. This is why it's congenial. Ryan says, Romney and Ryan both say, they're going to flay you alive, but only if you're under 55. Everybody who's already retired, everybody who's already over 65 and gets Medicare, and people between 55 and 65 will not be flayed alive in the same way. And you're supposed to believe that. In other words, these TV commentators say, oh, well, of course, they're not going to hurt anybody over 55. They're only going to go after those under 55. Who believes this garbage? It's a slippery slope. When you have a general fascist offensive to carve and destroy the social safety net, to roll back the New Deal, New Frontier, and Great Society reforms, these little quiddities are not going to make any difference. Remember, 80%, 4/5, 80% of the U.S. population says, hands off Medicare, hands off Social Security. Slightly less, but still huge majorities, hands off Medicaid, hands off unemployment benefits, and other vital reforms. So we have New Deal America. Don't ever forget it. This is New Deal America, and we've got a raving fascist anti-New Deal party, the Republicans, and then we've got a deception operation, right? A stab in the back to the New Deal which is the the Democratic Party under Obama. Let's take another couple of looks at Ryan. Under Ryan, there's no money for infrastructure, huh? No money. You can forget infrastructure. You're not going to rebuild anything because the rich parasites that back Ryan don't want to pay. Romney's background is also Empower America, right? Created by these right-wing characters, you know, the Vigories, the Ehrlichs, people like this, Wyrick, the older reactionary group. So he worked at, and Empower America then merged. I think today it's part of Americans for Prosperity. In other words, it's part of the Koch brothers machine. So you won't go wrong if you consider Ryan to be an employee of Koch. Ryan, of course, coming from the Walker-dominated Republican Party of Wisconsin. This is one of the most reactionary Republican state parties, and the House Republicans are the most extreme, reactionary, right-wing, fanatic, lunatic group in U.S. politics, okay? Now, in 1994, when Gingrich, with this lunatic group, took power as Speaker of the House, you know, we had Newsweek with Gingrich as Scrooge. He was proposing orphanages. In other words, the world of Dickensian cruelty, the world of social Darwinism. It is indeed social Darwinism. But now we've got to discuss, we've got to have a civil discussion if Ryan wants to kill hundreds of thousands or millions of Americans with his Shaktian austerity and genocide. Well, then we're supposed to have a polite discussion about that. This is moral insanity and moral bankruptcy writ large. Now we also have the attempt to sell Ryan to the millennials, right? To dupe the millennials again. The millennials duped once by Barack Obama, now bitter and disillusioned. The attempt is to dupe them again. Huffington Post: the screwed generation may be turning to Paul Ryan. Well, hey, millennials, you are crushed by $1 trillion of student loan debt. Ryan offers you nothing. Ryan voted to double the interest rate on your student loan debt, right, to get it up to 6.8 instead of 3.4. Democrats say 3.4. Republicans say 6.8. I say 0. Make the Federal Reserve pay. Zombie banks get 0% credit. U.S. students who want to have a future have got to have 0% credit. This is the absolute least you can do. So the goal, you can see what the goal is here behind this. The young college dupes who went for Ron Paul, right, the leprechaun, they are supposed to now switch to Ryan, right? I don't know whether that will work, but that's the attempt. Let's see. Biden is a hypocrite. Biden says that the Obama-Biden will not change Social Security. The Washington Post editorial of yesterday freaks out, saying, you're not supposed to say that because we want genocidal cuts right now. We even have Robert Samuelson, the nepotist, right? He's there because his father was a famous economist. I can't see any other reason. He's a no talent. So this Robert Samuelson says, Romney and Ryan want to exempt everybody over 55 from their genocidal cuts. That's the problem. That's not good enough. We need genocide across the board. We want genocidal cuts for people who are over 55, over 65. We don't care. And the Garden State Göring, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, you remember him. Well, his reincarnation, I suppose, of course, is the thuggish Governor Chris Christie of New Jersey, right? An anti-labor goon, hates voters, insults voters, right? He has a real track record of exploding with rage when people ask, you're cutting my kid's school, you send your kids to expensive private school. It's a little bit like Romney, except Christie responds as a gangster, and Romney responds as a Mormon, right? Romney goes into a secrecy crouch, whereas Christie starts making threats to these people. All right. I'm afraid we're going to have to go on now. We should mention some things about foreign policy. Maybe we'll get to this a little bit later in the show. Oh, let's just remember Romney's tax return. He won't show his tax return. This is one of the themes we want to develop. Obsessive secrecy is a feature of the Mormon hierarchy. The people who run the Mormon church have always been obsessively secret. And today, right, there are all kinds of documents that historians would like to have to look at the story of Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, people like this. You're not going to get them. Romney's tax return. Now, he says, Harry Reid is an interesting development, right? Harry Reid, representing the nexus of Mormondom with organized crime, right? The Nevada gambling casinos, right? Remember, Las Vegas was founded by Brigham Young, the prophet, from 1847 to 1877, right? The St. Paul of Mormonism, we might say. He founded Las Vegas, but it took a little while to build it up into what it is today. Harry Reid is the one who is assumed to represent the interface between the Mormons and the casino interests. And the Mormons, in some ways, are the casino interest in many ways, because this was their bailiwick. Look at the map, part of the Inland Empire. Harry Reid says Romney didn't pay any taxes. Well, let's look at the terminology here. When you say taxes, what does it mean? Romney now says, I always paid at least 13% taxes. Yeah, taxes. There are federal taxes. There's the federal income tax. That's one thing. There's also sales tax in many states. I think there are still excise taxes on certain imported commodities. There may still be. Certainly, there's a state income tax. Most states you live in, if you live in Massachusetts or Michigan, certainly there's a state income tax. There's also a property tax. Try as he will, Romney may have wage income. In that case, he's going to pay a payroll tax, right? He may have self-employment income, payroll tax. So when Romney says 13%, does that mean federal income tax, or does that mean a combination of sales tax, state tax, property tax, payroll tax, and other taxes? Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Now let's get into some of the historical background. The idea here is that Romney is a devoted Mormon. He is a devoted militant of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. What does this mean? What does this represent? Is it a church like any other? Is it like the Presbyterians, the Methodists, the Episcopalians, the Roman Catholics, whatever it is? The answer to that is no. It is much more close-knit. It is much more aggressive. It acts as a bloc far more than any of those, which are politically, especially the Roman Catholics, differentiated 6 ways to Sunday. It is not Christian. I'm sorry. Somebody wrote me saying, oh, but it's the Book of Mormon is another gospel of Jesus Christ. Yeah, that was pasted on there in 1981. So I don't see that as being authoritative. It's not Christian. It's not Judaism. It's not Islam. And it's not American, because, as we will see, for decades and decades and decades, they referred to Americans as the enemy. The damned Americans, we find, in Salt Lake City, all over the place. The Gentiles, the Americans and the Gentiles are the enemy. And the Indian tribes in the Great Basin also found this distinction to be meaningful. We find one interesting quote where an Indian chief says, American good, Mormon bad. So the Indians see this as two separate nations, and I think we should take this seriously. The Romneys are royalty. They are a Mormon political dynasty, and the reason they're a dynasty is not so much because of the Romney family, but because of the Pratts. Parley P. Pratt. Parley P. Pratt, there's a canyon named after him out in Utah where he set up his first toll booth, ripping people off, ripping off miners as they trekked to the gold rush in California in 1848. Parley P. Pratt, the Archer of Paradise. When we pick up one of Romney's books, Let's take at his book, Turnaround. Turnaround is his story of how he covered up the scandal around the Salt Lake City Winter Olympics of 2002. There was bribery, and the bribery of foreign officials was done by giving tuition rebates or paying tuition to the sons, daughters, and relatives of foreign Olympic officials, especially from Africa, but also from Korea, Finland, all over the world. Romney was brought in to cover that up because the people who were indicted for it, we don't need to get so much into the names. You can find these in the written report. The people who were indicted for it said, Governor Mike Leavitt knew everything we did. Governor Mike Leavitt, currently the head of Romney's transition team. Governor Leavitt knew everything, and they were never able to prove that. On the other hand, these guys were not convicted. But Romney, in his book Turnaround, where he tries to cover up this story, tries to pose as the great savior of the Olympics instead of the cover-up artist who saved Leavitt and others even higher up in Mormondom. He says, the mountain pass that leads pioneers down into Salt Lake Valley, which is today Interstate 80, was first explored by my great-great-grandfather, Parley P. Pratt. Parley P. Pratt. And he built a road as an act of speculation and then charged tolls to prospectors. Okay, Parley P. Pratt. He is the Archer of Paradise, second, or really third only to Joseph Smith and to Brigham Young, or at least he's up there with them. He is one of the top Mormons of these first decades. Parley P. Pratt, polygamist, 12 wives total, denied polygamy, and we'll see that he denied that he was a polygamist when he was. We'll see how Parley P. Pratt had a bad end. But the side of Romney, if you want to do research on Romney and the family, you say, well, if they're Mormon royalty, right? If they've been in the quorum of the 12 for 7 generations, we'll look up the Romneys and we'll find them that way. You won't, because you'll find it under the Pratts. And the trick is that the Romneys and the Pratts intermarried somewhat later. So the Romneys, 7-generation Mormon royalty, a Mormon political dynasty. Romney, we read last week all these quotes where he says he loves his faith, he'll never renege it, it's the faith of his fathers, the tradition. His past himself is that he was a Mormon missionary in France. He was a stake president in the Boston suburbs. He has 5 sons. They all attended Brigham Young University, Mormon University, named after a hardened traitor and monster. And they are all married to Mormon women, and they all got married in the Mormon temple. So this is Mormon all the way. He cannot and will not flee from this. But now the question is, what does it mean? Romney has a pattern of flip-flopping. In other words, the doctrine changes. He's got a pattern of hypocrisy. He's got a pattern of secrecy. Let's just take a couple of these things like flip-flops. If we take polygamy, right, very important feature of Mormon life and theology, polygamy is denied in the Book of Mormon. It says one wife. Then it was practiced by Joseph Smith, practiced by the Mormon elite, but always denied. Joseph Smith always denied that he was a polygamist. Well, he was a polygamist up to the sum of 60, 70, 80 wives. 84 wives, I think, is the high-end estimate. But he always denied it. And this was limited to the Mormon elite. Under Brigham Young sees that if you get people to become polygamists, even the humble ones, even poor farmers, you've got them. One of the main problems is once you get to Salt Lake City and environs, a lot of people want to leave. So they have a reign of terror to protect you, to prevent you from leaving. They won't let you leave. They'll put you in jail if they think you're trying to leave. But another way to do it is once you've got everybody engaged in polygamy, you can't go anywhere else because there's nowhere else in the Western world, and maybe from some of them for the world in general, where you could go and practice polygamy in the way that they wanted to. So in the case of Joseph Smith, it's that he can't control himself. Joseph Smith says, every time I see a pretty woman, I have to pray for grace. He just got carried away 80 times or so. And then, in the case of Brigham Young, though, it's a much more organizational, calculated view of what he's doing. But just to take polygamy, the flip-flops, the hypocrisy, and the secrecy. First, it's denied. Then it's practiced. And, well, first it's ruled out. It's condemned. Then it's secretly practiced but publicly denied. Then, starting in 1852, under Brigham Young, it's proclaimed and practiced, flagrantly. Then, in 1890, it's abolished. But other groups, right, the fundamentalist Latter-day Saints, the group that leads to Warren Jeffs, down there in southern Utah on the Arizona border, right, Hillsdale, Utah, and the town on the other side, Colorado City, Arizona, it's still practiced. And then you wonder today, what's the status, right? It turns out that even back in the 1880s, sometimes rich Mormons would, instead of keeping their wives together in one place, they would have wives in different apartments scattered around town. Well, today, with the jet set, you could have wives scattered all over the country, all over the world. Nobody would know. So the cultish aspect, as has been pointed out, is if you have a religion that says what we teach today is the absolute truth, but then you see that this is changing, and indeed that there's a contradiction between what they say and what they do, I think you get an idea. And the secrecy, of course, is already shown as a part of this. So hypocrisy, secrecy, and flip-flops, there are many, many examples. Now let's get into some of the actual sources. Romney comes on like a super patriot, right? He's got his one book I've mentioned, the Turnaround book, but he's got another book called No Apology. I don't know, what does that mean? He's not going to apologize for his own tradition? No, he means that Obama apologizes for the U.S., but Romney is the super patriot, and he's not going to apologize. He had to apologize, really, to the British when he insulted their Olympics, but that's another matter. So no apology, I'm a super patriot. Let's look at, we're going to see in the next hour how much of a super patriot he is. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Keep up with everything at Tarpley.net, Tarpley.net, Webster G. Tarpley Twitter feed. So Romney is a super patriot, right? Romney's not like Obama. We have this book here, No Apology, Romney's latest campaign biography. He's had several. And he whines that Obama has issued apologies, criticisms of America in speeches in France, England, Turkey, Cairo, CIA headquarters, National Archives, United Nations. He gets praise from Fidel Castro, Chavez, and Gaddafi. Muammar Gaddafi said, we'd be content and happy if Obama can stay president forever. Shows the ability of Obama to dupe people. But, of course, this makes the great patriot Romney completely indignant. And at the end of his book here, he's got the sort of the crescendo, my country, 'tis of thee, we love our country, and on, right? So he's a great patriot, right? He's going to defend the reputation of American exceptionalism. Well, his family tradition looks different. Romney family values, number one, polygamy. Not patriotism, polygamy. Polygamy trumps patriotism, and we can find this in a number of books. The Real Mitt Romney, from a couple of guys from the Boston Globe, and here we find that his another great-great-grandfather, or let's see, great-grandfather, Miles Romney the Younger. The original Romney who came over from Britain, from northern England, is Miles A. Romney, but then we have Miles P. Romney. Both of these guys work for Brigham Young as home builders and home designers. I guess architect is a little bit much, but that's the idea. They help Brigham Young build his palace there in St. George, Utah. But they're told at a certain point, go to Arizona. They go there, and they flee to Mexico, to Colonia Juarez, Mexico, in order to practice polygamy. So the idea is, I'm a great American patriot. But wait a minute, you can't practice polygamy. Viva Mexico! So Mexico is better. They're devoted to Mexico because it will allow them to practice polygamy. And I'm not kidding. Reporters have now gone to Colonia Juarez, and they find that there's still a Mormon colony there, and there are still guys named Romney who are there. Romney has cousins in Mexico who got back there. The reason that they left Colonia Juarez was not because they were overtaken by some great patriotism for the United States, but that the army of Pancho Villa was coming along. Pancho Villa was coming to get them, so they ran away. And we have a very interesting outburst by George Romney, right, the father of the current MIT. George Romney, the guy who became president of American Motors, says in the course of this, let's see if I can find you the exact quote, he essentially says, the reason that we had to leave was because of these Mexican revolutionaries, and let's see, they're down there practicing polygamy. Anyway, the basic idea of this quote is that they and it's very interesting because it's exactly the kind of thing that you've heard out of the mouth of Romney, that the Pancho Villa people were envious of our success. The politics of envy was practiced by Pancho Villa and the Republic and the revolutionaries in the Mexican Revolution. Pancho Villa envied our prosperity, and they thought that if they could simply take it away from us, that they could enjoy the same prosperity. But it doesn't work that way, says George Romney. Right? George Romney, born in Mexico, 1907. It's actually interesting. If George Romney had gotten anywhere near the presidency, he would not have been eligible. This is for sure. He was born in Mexico in 1907 in a Mormon polygamous colony for people who claim, who were not going to come back to the United States ever. So I think in this case we have to ask ourselves, what is the great patriotism of Romney? Now, I want to help people along. There will be a written report coming soon, but if you want to do a little work on your own, let's try to facilitate that, certainly. If you want to read up on this stuff, you want to read a biography of Joseph Smith, Fawn Brody, and the title of this is No Man Knows My History. This could apply to Mitt Romney, too. No man knows my history because I don't want him to. Fawn Brody, No Man Knows My History. That's the best biography of Joseph Smith. The best biography of Brigham Young is called The Lion of the Lord by Stanley P. Hirschson, Hirshson, Hirschson. If you want to learn about a very interesting topic which we'll be discussing today, the Mormon Rebellion, the Utah War of 1857 to 1858, the First Civil War, the First Secessionism, the first attempt by a territory to leave the United States. This is done by Brigham Young and the Mormons. Then I would recommend Bigler and Bagley, The Mormon Rebellion. That's good reading. And if you want to look at the Mormons during the Civil War, again under the hardened traitor and secessionist Brigham Young, then I would recommend The Saints and the Union, Utah Territory during the Civil War, written by Long, Long, E.B. Long, the Mormon Territory. If you want to also a couple of other books, but those are the main ones. So let's start looking now. Let's see what Fawn Brody can tell us here. Right? The tradition. Mormon Church originates in Palmyra, New York, in the 1830s, starting about 1830, right? And we won't go through the story of the golden plates and the angel Moroni, and we will not go so much today into the theology, although this is interesting. The main interest here is politics, and the basic thesis is, and we'll back it up, the Mormon Church is part of a pattern. At the height of the British Empire, in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, we have a series of attempts by British intelligence to destabilize countries and facilitate imperial domination by London using religious and ideological formations. And I think I mentioned this before. My old friend, the late Professor Ali Mazaheri of Paris, was an Iranian working in one of the French universities, School of Social Sciences, École Pratique des Hautes Études, I think it is. He always said there are three miracles of the Victorian age. Karl Marx is one miracle, who split the working class against the industrialists in continental Europe to the greater glory of the British Empire. The Bab, who founded the Baha'i religion, which was a means of precipitating a group of ex-Muslims who could go to work for the British colonial administration, and Joseph Smith and the Mormons, right? And I would add to this the celestial kingdom of the Taiping in 1840s, 1850s. You have a Christian, again, I use the word advisedly, a Christian rebellion in southwest China, which is very little known, but it's the biggest military event of the 19th century. 20 to 30 million people, were killed, with armies between 3 and 5 million, perhaps bigger than the Napoleonic Wars, certainly bigger than the American Civil War. We'll be back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Professor Mazaheri of Paris used to say the three miracles of the Victorian age, the height of the world power of the British Empire, when the British were contending for absolute world domination. Remember, between the Napoleonic Wars and the American Civil War, they had attacked China with the Opium Wars, Russia with the Crimean Wars, the French had attacked Mexico, the Spanish had taken over Hispaniola once again, violating the Monroe Doctrine. The British were on the march everywhere. You had the Sepoy Mutiny or Great Mutiny in India. This is all an attempt to destroy any center of resistance, to tend towards, I guess, something of what we've had now under U.S. auspices in the last couple of decades. And as part of this, say part of the weakening of China, is the celestial kingdom of the Taiping. And again, I stress, 20 to 30 million dead, with armies of several million on each side, waging total war, burning crops, burning cities, and so forth, all because the leader of this decided that he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ. So, Karl Marx and Marxism, to split the continental Europeans, play the workers against the industrialists. The Bab, to introduce a schism inside of Islam. The Taiping, to destroy Chinese society from the inside. And Joseph Smith and Mormonism. And the idea is that when you have apocalyptic, antinomian, messianic movements, they will tend to destroy the society that they're in, more or less. This is not new, right? Savonarola, unleashed by the Venetians against Florence in the 1490s. Same story. And as I hope to show before too long, Martin Luther, similarly, unleashed by the Venetians. That Venetian tradition transmigrated to Britain. It's the Byzantine tradition, and it says religious entities serve state policy. And this is not good. Got to keep them separate. That's the genius of the Western world. But, of course, for the Mormons, that's impossible. The Mormons want a theocracy. You know, Al-Qaeda says that if you're not the caliphate, you're not a legitimate government. Well, there are lots of Mormons from Joseph Smith Brigham Young who say the only acceptable form of political organization is the kingdom of God, a theocracy, or theodemocracy, as Joseph Smith tried to say when he was running for president. It's got to be a theocracy, and it can't be representative government. It's got to be ruled by prophets, right? It's got to be ruled under revelations, not under public laws. So, the Mormons always show, Joseph Smith always shows that he has a really good world intelligence picture. He is well informed. Now, very early example of this, December 25th, 1832. We are in the middle of the nullification crisis with South Carolina, right? The tariff, modest as it was considered a tariff of abominations by the hotheads, the fire eaters, the subversives down in South Carolina, down in that cradle of secessionism. And they were threatening to nullify and then to leave the Union. And Andrew Jackson, bad as he was, didn't want to take it that far at the moment, felt he was personally being challenged. So bad fights bad, and somehow the U.S. survived the moment. That's how the government is supposed to work, right? Make bad, fight bad to diminish the total amount of bad. But here we are, Joseph Smith, on Christmas Day, 1832. He says, "Verily, thus saith the Lord, concerning the wars that will shortly come to pass, beginning at the rebellion of South Carolina, which will eventually terminate in the death and misery of many souls, and the time will come that war will be poured out upon all nations, beginning at this place. For behold, the southern states shall be divided against the northern states, and the southern states will call on other nations, even the nation of Great Britain, as it is called, and they shall also call upon other nations in order to defend themselves, and war shall be poured out upon all nations." And then the usual apocalyptic stuff, right? If you want to know where the apocalyptic style in the right-wing libertarian community comes from, look no further. "It shall come to pass after many days, slaves shall rise up against their masters, and thus with the sword and by bloodshed the inhabitants of this earth shall mourn, and with famine and plague and earthquake and thunder of heaven and fierce and vivid lightning the inhabitants of the earth shall be made to feel the wrath and indignation and chastening hand of Almighty God." So here's a prediction from 1832 of a civil war with the British intervening on the side of the Confederacy, basically, what almost happened, and which was unquestionably in the 1830s already the plan of the British and U.S. Freemasonic Confederate, Dixiecrat networks that eventually carried out secession. So you could say even in 1832, he's already tuned in, wired in to British intelligence. But now let's be a little bit more specific. Here we are in June of 1835. We have a British clergyman, the Reverend John Hewitt, comes to visit the Mormons. Now, by this time, I believe they're in Kirtland, Ohio, right? They're taking part in the massive speculation, right? The pet banks leading up to the Panic of 1837, terrible event for the United States. So it turns out that Hewitt represents some charismatic Pentecostalists, some people who like to speak in tongues, and they have prophets who come to their services and they prophesy in the middle of the service. This is called the Catholic Apostolic Church. And this gets us right to the heart of the British establishment once again. So the Catholic Apostolic Church, charismatic Pentecostalist mystics in Britain, say, oh, the Mormons are a kindred spirit. Now, undoubtedly, they knew about the Mormons. I am not arguing that it was British intelligence that put the golden plates in the hands of Joseph Smith. That would be too much. But once Joseph Smith published that book, the Book of Mormon, right, 1830, thereabouts, then London is going to pick up on it, and they're going to see what can be done with this guy, as they did with Luther and others, right? Similar pattern. So they say, oh, the Holy Spirit is blowing there in Britain. Interesting parallels. The Catholic Apostolic Church has 12 apostles, right? The quorum of the 12. in effect, that's not conclusive, but at least it's something. Now, here we go. The Catholic Apostolic Church gets you right to the top of the British government and the British Foreign Office. The Catholic Apostolic Church originated in the preaching of Edward Irving. Edward Irving is a Scottish Presbyterian who found this new church, and he, interestingly enough, is a great friend of Thomas Carlyle, the essayist. And Thomas Carlyle, the Victorian essayist, is one of the heirs of Jeremy Bentham, running the British Literary Intelligence Establishment. Back in a minute. We'll come back to World Crisis Radio. So we've just had the prophecy from Joseph Smith of the Civil War with the British intervening, as was the intention. This is from Christmas 1832. We got Joseph Smith saying the British are going to come and help South Carolina to secede from the Union. There's going to be a terrible war. And then in 1835, we get the British emissary Reverend Hewitt, who comes and spends a few days with the Mormons, profiles them, undoubtedly sends a report. And then the connections go into another form. The Catholic Apostolic Church, founded by Edward Irving, mystic, charismatic Pentecostalist. And again, if you pick up Thomas Carlyle, very famous Victorian essayist, man of letters, his big book is Reminiscences. The Reminiscences of Thomas Carlyle, well, he's got a part about his own wife, but even before that, he's got Edward Irving. So you're talking top-level British intelligence. Carlyle, of course, the controller of Ralph Waldo Emerson, close to Mazzini. We could go on and on. Let's just see here one of our sources. The Catholic Apostolic Church, which is, again, Edward Irving, the charismatic Pentecostalist, who sends this envoy to meet the Mormons in 1835. The Catholic Apostolic Church originated in the preaching of Edward Irving, a Scottish Presbyterian who had moved to London in 1822 and had quickly attracted a fashionable following, the upper class, the bosses, the elite, the British aristocracy. So large and stylish were his congregations that the coaches of the people coming to hear him lined up for 4 miles outside his Caledonian Chapel in Hatton Garden. His followers included members of Parliament, rich lawyers and bankers, clergymen from the Church of England and the Scottish Kirk. Thomas Carlyle, the famous essayist, came to hear him, and George Canning, the British foreign minister, mentioned Irving's name favorably in Parliament. So here we have the British Foreign Secretary, George Canning, endorses this guy Irving and the Catholic Apostolic Church in the British Parliament. It is a branch of the British Foreign Office, and that's who gets in touch with the Mormons in 1835. Get the picture? And again, with Carlyle, he seems to have a specialty for the U.S., but not only, right? He's in touch with Ralph Waldo Emerson, is basically his guy. And then in 1837, Joseph Smith sends his first group over to England, and this is now Heber Kimball and Orson Hyde. The two of them are sent to England in 1837, so 2 years after that. And in 1839, he says, the quorum of the 12, the whole leadership of the Mormon Church, has to make a pilgrimage to England for recruiting. And one of them is Mitt Romney's great-great-grandfather, Parley P. Pratt. Now, setting up an operation in England is not something you can do unless the British government approves what you're doing. They set up a newspaper called the Millennial Star, right? Again, apocalyptic. They don't get anywhere in London. They don't get anywhere in the south of England, it's clear. But in the north, among the factory people, in the wretched of the earth, people who are poor, again, wretched of the earth, superstitious, miserable, the Mormons can recruit them. And what Brigham Young sets up is a travel agency, basically, where they say, and this is nothing new, right? This is the indentured servant pattern. It used to be in the 18th century. You want to go to the New World, you got to, if you can't pay for the passage in the ship, can't pay the fare, you got to become an indentured servant for 2 or 3 years after that, or how many years, and that way you pay for your trip. Well, the Mormons do pretty much the same thing. You're going to owe them when you get there. They'll send you to New Orleans and up the Mississippi River, and then to Nauvoo, or later on to Salt Lake City, wherever it is. So they set up a recruiting base in England, and they ultimately recruit 30,000 saints to come to the New World. And they also set up a multi-thousand congregation over there. In other words, there's a whole Mormon establishment inside Britain. Now, again, I submit, you can't create a newspaper in England and you can't carry on these activities unless the government has decided to tolerate you. Otherwise, and we do have some examples of this, right? The local parish priests of the Church of England are going to get after you, right? Because you're muscling in on their racket, and then you'll be repressed, right? Then the beadle will come after you. But in this case, it doesn't happen. Yeah, it's not going to happen because Foreign Secretary George Canning, who later became the Prime Minister, I believe, has endorsed them in Parliament, and Thomas Carlyle, undoubtedly there are other connections. You've also got, during the career of the Mormons, you got a parade of British agent types who come over there. One very obvious one, Sir Richard Burton. Sir Richard Burton is the Orientalist who did the 1001 Nights, right? Scheherazade, the Arabian Nights. He's a profiler, mainly from the Middle East, but, he's seen the harems of the Ottoman Empire. He's going to see the harems of Brigham Young in Salt Lake City. Another important one is Edwin de Leon. This is a guy who later becomes a Confederate, but he spends some time there also profiling. So the intelligence connections are huge. Now, the White Horse prophecy, right? The thing that Mitt Romney may be attempting to carry out. Essentially with this prophecy, we have Joseph Smith making these predictions. Let's see if we can find the White Horse prophecy. One other thing is that at a certain point, Joseph Smith believes that he can actually get Queen Victoria and Prince Albert to convert to become Mormons. Well, no, that won't work. But he wants to do it, and he has these poetasters who write stories about it. So the White Horse prophecy. This is we have several versions of this. We want to look at one of the longer ones. Let's go through this. The White Horse prophecy. And then they're going to say, oh, no, it's not really an official prophecy at all. Now we are in 1843 with Joseph Smith. So we've had the prediction of the Civil War in 1832. We've had the first people sent over. We've had the British envoy coming to see the Mormons in 1835. In 1837, Joseph Smith sends 2 top honchos to Britain. In 1839, I believe he sends the entire 12, I think we said. They stay over there for a year and a half, right? Missionaries. But then in 1843, we have another prophecy here. And this is the White Horse prophecy. This is that they're going to have political power for the Mormons. And the question is this what Romney is determined to carry out? Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Okay, let's see if we can finish covering this now. So the idea is the relation of the Mormons to British intelligence, the following. 1832, Joseph Smith's Civil War prophecy, with the British intervening on the side of the Confederates, which was the British plan. 1835, the representative of the Edward Irving's Catholic Apostolic Church, endorsed by the Foreign Secretary George Canning, Thomas Carlyle, bigwigs. This guy arrives as an emissary to the Mormons. In 1837, Joseph Smith sends Kimball and Hyde to Britain. In 1839, Joseph Smith orders the quorum of the 12 apostles, all of them, to go to Britain and set up the recruiting and publishing operation there. They actually depart in 1840. Now, somewhat later, we're talking 1843 at this point. We got the May 1843, we've got the White Horse Prophecy. So the White Horse Prophecy is, again, they'll claim that it's not binding, it's not what they believe, but I'm sorry, this is a shelf doctrine. Again, everybody, many churches have esoteric. Esoteric, what they tell the public at large. Esoteric is what they tell themselves secretly in elites, and the exoteric is for the public at large. So the idea of this is then that he's talking to a couple of people, and he says, I will speak in a parable like St. John the Revelator. You will go to the Rocky Mountains, and you will be a great and mighty people established there, which I will call the White Horse of Peace and Safety. So the Mormons are going to be sent there. Now, the idea, of course, is if you control the Intermountain West and the Great Basin, you can cut off California and Oregon from the eastern part of the United States, because the British plan is not just to have southern secessionism, but then a series of secessions so that you completely balkanize the North American continent, and it never ends. So he tells them, keep petitioning Congress for redress of grievances, but the principal thing is the Constitution will hang by a thread. This is the part that is entered into the Mormon lore. You will see the Constitution of the United States almost destroyed. It will hang like a thread as fine as a silk fiber. And then he goes into this thing. I love the Constitution. It was made by the inspiration of God. It will be preserved and saved by the efforts of the White Horse. This is doublethink. In other words, I'm going to create a theocracy, but at the same time I'm going to claim that it's the Constitution. This is the degradation of the concept of the Constitution to a kind of buzzword, which we see in so many reactionaries today, right? They talk about the Constitution. It has nothing to do with the Constitution. Just, I don't like it. It must be unconstitutional. The Constitution will be preserved and saved by the efforts of the White Horse and by the Red Horse, who will combine in its defense. Now, I told you already last week, the British are the red, right? The red coats. This does not change. He tells you later on in the same prophecy, the British are always associated with red. One of the particular features of England is the established red coat. It makes them a target, but they still conquer the world. So the White Horse and the Red Horse will team up against the Pale Horse. The Pale Horse is the United States of America, the bad guys, the Gentiles, the damned Americans. There'll be lots of wealth in the Rocky Mountains, but there will be a tremendous economic crisis. The banks of every nation will fall. Sounds like the deflationary crash desired by the Austrian school. The time will come when the banks of every nation will fall, and the only two places that will be safe, where people can deposit their gold and treasure, will be the White Horse, the Mormons in the Rocky Mountains, and the Bank of England. Terrible revolution will take place in the United States. brother against brother, mother against daughter, daughter against mother, murder, bloodshed, and rape, but there will be peace and love in the Rocky Mountains. Hundreds of thousands will flock into the Rocky Mountains. Many will come with bundles under their arms. They want to flee to Zion. And the Turkish Empire of the Crescent will be crushed because they have to be forced to allow the preaching of the gospel. They've also, you're going to have the best people flocking to England and Great Britain. God has given England and Great Britain power in the nations for 1,000 years. This is an endorsement. And it's England and France are going to ally. Right? This is already going on under Louis Philippe and the July monarchy, and even more than under Napoleon III. England and France will be bitter enemies, but they will ally together to keep Russia from conquering the world. The Greek Patriarch and the Roman Pope will have to be united. They'll be merged. And what a wonderful guy Henry VIII was. It's all Anglophile, all pro-British. The lion and the unicorn of England, these are great symbols. And then there's something called the Black Horse, and the Black Horse is the slaves, the black Afro-American slaves. There's going to be this huge war. The Black Horse will flee to the invaders and join them because they're afraid of becoming slaves again. So it looks like the white horse of Mormonism, the red horse of the British, the black horse of the slave rebellion, which he's already talked about before, will rise up, and this will basically destroy the pale horse. During this time, the white horse will have gathered strength, will send out our elders, and will gather in the honest of heart from the pale horse, the people of the United States, and get them to stand by the Constitution. The good people from Germany, Norway, Denmark, Switzerland, Holland, and Belgium, this is where the Mormons primarily recruited, especially England, but also Northern Europe. Only Lutheran areas, Protestant areas, not Catholic areas, came to them. There will be peace and safety in the Rocky Mountains, protected by the guardians, the white horse and the red horse, and the coming of the Messiah will be so natural that it practically, it'll just be a smooth continuum. There's a danger from the Chinese. The heathen Chinese will invade the land beyond the Rocky Mountains. That has to be stopped. And then Gog and Magog come on the scene. The nations of the earth will be led by the Russian Tsar, and his power will be great. But all opposition will be overcome, and this land will be the Zion of our God. Amen. So the white horse of Mormonism and the red horse of the British Empire will defeat the Russian Tsar, identified with Gog and Magog. This is a British intelligence picture, totally. This is the strategic doctrine of the British Empire in the 19th century. Remember, said it many times, the main strategic conflict of the 19th century in the Eurasian area is the British against the Russians, always the same, from the Napoleonic Wars up until the coming of King Edward VII. There's 100 years where they're always on different sides. So this is a British intelligence picture. Notice that Romney says the same thing. Romney says Russia is the biggest geopolitical foe. Well, he's following the white horse prophecy, and we find many interesting magazine articles saying that when Romney was at the Brigham Young, he was considered to be the great hope of Mormondom. He's the guy who's going to carry out the white horse prophecy. Now, after the killing of Joseph Smith, as we went through last week, in 1844, they insert the oath of vengeance. And remember, it goes, "You and each of you do covenant and promise that you will pray and never cease to pray to Almighty God to avenge the blood of the prophet," Joseph Smith and Hiram Smith, "upon this nation, the United States of America, and that you will teach the same to your children and your children's children until the third and fourth generation." That was in the official liturgy until 1927. It means that Romney's father, George, took the oath. George, Nit, Tag, and their children, all bound by the oath of vengeance, perhaps. We don't want to find out. We'll be delving into this next time. In the meantime, you want to get more, watch Tarpley.net and Webster G. Tarpley Twitter feed. And we will see you next week here on World Crisis Radio. Extreme reactionary, or indeed fascist, right? Schachtian, there's no other way to put it. The economics of Hjalmar Schacht, the economics that leads to a concentration camp, because that's the ultimate logic of it. Super austerity, well, what's the most extreme austerity? The most extreme austerity is a concentration camp. So once you're on the austerity bandwagon and the $1 trillion in cuts, well, where does that lead? It leads to someplace rather ugly. The purpose of some of these candidacies is to make this kind of economics, Schachtian economics, presentable, that it can be debated in polite society, rather than laughed out as crackpot or outright fascist. Now, in the case of Paul Ryan, we have what I would call Ron Paul light, in the sense that he wants savage, genocidal austerity cuts, but he does it as a young guy and smiling and supposedly reasonable. Now, in reality, he is an extremist. This is a reactionary. This is a thug. This is an exterminator of the American people who wants to become vice president. His plan, of course, for Medicare, you're going to get a voucher. The voucher will be worth a few $1,000s. If you need a medical procedure that costs more than the voucher and you haven't got the money to make up the difference, too bad. It was nice knowing you. You are dead. And with Social Security, privatize it, which, of course, means a bonanza in terms of commissions for Wall Street brokers and other parasites. That's the essence of Paul Ryan. And watch out for that widow's peak. The widow's peak is an omen that somebody's going to die. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Keep up with all of this at Tarpley.net, Webster G. Tarpley Twitter feed. Let's look at Paul Ryan, fascist economist, because he is. What is his ideological matrix? What is the structure, the institutional historical structure that underlies this Republican ticket of Romney and Ryan? Well, Romney, of course, we know, a bishop of the Mormon Church, right, a Freemasonic religious formation. You look at Paul Ryan, the betting here is that he's also a Freemason. But the one thing we know for sure is this is a Republican because we want to get this anti-austerity resistance front going, the National Anti-Austerity Committees, the New Deal coalitions. There's a conference quite possibly in the works for, quite possibly, again, New York City, quite possibly in late September or October. There's a website that will also cast light on this issue, specifically devoted to the organizing of this. So that's the general framework, and we'll refer back to this austerity issue as we go through what's actually happening. The first thing you have to understand is the ruling class wants Romney. This is fundamental. One of the first questions you have to ask yourself, as we did 4 years ago with Obama, who is the ruling class backing? This right now may not be so clear as it was with Obama. And in the case of Obama, it was an overwhelmingly clear choice by the ruling class in favor of Obama. But that was then. This is now. I see a lot of people who are normally rather judicious who are fighting the last war. People who are devoting 100% of their time to attacking Obama, I think, are being very, very foolish. And they are fighting the last war, right? This used to be said of the French army. They were always ready for the previous conflict. And that's the way you lose the current one. We don't need to go into too much detail on that. But don't fight the last war. We know all about Obama. I wrote 2 books about Obama. I'm second to none in opposition to Obama. I did everything I could when that would have yielded results. I tried to spare the world from the ordeal of Obama. That was then. This is now. And now you have a new, brutal, genocidal enemy typified by the Paul Ryan vice presidential nomination. But just the question of the ruling class. How do we know that the ruling class is for Romney? Two things. The first thing is you can now see that in terms of Wall Street contributions and other fat cat, plutocrat money contributions, Romney is pulling ahead. That's number one. Normally a sitting president would always be ahead, but not in the case of the asset stripper, hedge fund hyena, corporate raider, and Wall Street bandit, Romney. Deeply rooted in a tradition of politician from the state of Wisconsin. And in modern times, to be a Republican politician from the state of Wisconsin, you have got to reflect the views of the infamous and much mocked John Birch Society. The Birchers, the John Birch Society. They were mocked, of course. They deserve to be mocked. They are an obscenity. They are a parody of themselves. That would be Bob Dylan's song about the paranoid John Birch Society, the Chad Mitchell Trio, Dr. Strangelove, right? The guy who's obsessed with his precious bodily fluids is supposed to be a General Jack Ripper. Of course, he's a figure for the Birchers. The John Birch Society were the people who were so extreme that they said General Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, is a conscious agent of the world communist conspiracy, right? Lunacy. But what was considered an obscene joke in the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s is now knocking on the door of power in the person of Paul Ryan. Now, what does that have to do with Mormondom? Simply this, that the John Birch Society over the years has become more and more a kind of satellite of the Mormons. This is a kind of a political front sponsored by various groups of Mormons. Examples: Ezra Taft Benson was the Mormon representative in Eisenhower's cabinet. He served 8 years as Secretary of Agriculture, trying to undo the various New Deal reforms. Ezra Taft Benson then became the top honcho, the first president of the Mormon Church. He encouraged people to support the John Birch Society. Ezra Taft Benson, top Mormon, loves the John Birch Society. You know, it got to the point where it became embarrassing. They had to take a step back in 1963. One of the embarrassing points was the John Birch Society was out there saying Eisenhower is a commie, and Ezra Taft Benson, who owed his cabinet post to Eisenhower made the mistake of making him great. So he's basically supporting a group that slanders the president, his own boss. Kind of duplicity that we'll find frequently in these analyses. So that's one side of it. In the middle of the Audis, right around. Welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley speaking to you from Washington, D.C. Now, this week we're going to have to delve deeply into U.S. domestic politics. And in particular, we're going to be showcasing Bishop Romney and his tradition. I hope you'll be looking at Tarpley.net. I always hope you look at Tarpley.net and indeed Webster G. Tarpley Twitter feed, but Tarpley.net, within a week or 10 days before the Republican convention starts, I believe, we're going to have a possibility for you to get the kind of report that I'm putting together. Think of it as a kind of a special report on Romney and his tradition. Bishop Romney, I should say. He is a bishop, a Mormon bishop, and he has a tradition. Does he ever? And we have to look into the cultural, ideological matrix that this represents. Where does this guy come from? This is how we can tell what he's likely to do. Tradition is destiny. Biography is destiny, to some extent. Actually, we always have free will. But in general, when you're dealing with these low-grade subjects, like Obama and Romney, biography and tradition and connections are very much their destiny. So we are going to look at this in some detail. Now, our attention in terms of the organizing perspective remains fixed on the campaign to stop austerity. And you can simply see this in the campaign now, the ruling class in general, is building up to an orgy of genocidal austerity. Ron Paul did yeoman service. He was the point man. He was a kind of a shockwave out in front of everything. Ron Paul's yeoman service is to make reactionary to fascist economics presentable, that you can discuss them, that you're not laughed out as a crank and a crackpot, which would be one way, or you're not sent to Nuremberg to face charges, which is what happened to people who actually did these things back in the 1930s and 1940s. So we want to focus on Romney, but we're doing this also because Mormon financial flimflam that we'll go through. One of the Mormon traditions is counterfeiting. The accusations, according to many sources, the accusations of counterfeiting were about as frequent as the accusations of polygamy against the Mormons. So with the Mormons, you've got a religion, not just of polygamy, but also of counterfeiting in terms of what they actually did. The campaign contributions are going to Romney. Even more important, in terms of a political indicator, the Federal Reserve is doing nothing to help Obama, and that means they're helping Romney. Normally a president would call up Bernanke and say, look, I want you to inject $500 billion of liquidity, right? Let's get a little pop going here, right? Let's sort of goose the economy and see if we can't get a mild upturn in September or October. It's probably too late for that now. It still might be attempted. But all that stuff from Bernanke about how he stands ready to take action if unemployment remains too high. Well, unemployment has been too high for 4 years, Ben. Get out of your helicopter. And that was what was behind that exchange between Chucky Schumer and Helicopter Ben at the last Humphrey Hawkins hearings in the Senate. Schumer said to Bernanke very pointedly, Mr. President of the Board of Governors, or whatever his title is, unemployment is very high. Yeah, said Bernanke. Get to work, said Schumer. Get to work means give us QE3, give us $500 billion, start buying U.S. government securities. Let's get a little bit of momentum. Right? This is not a recovery. This is just an uptick in the context of the Depression, but they can do that. And the fact that they don't do it shows that the ruling class wants Romney. So if you're giving Romney a free ride, if you're giving Romney a free pass and concentrating everything on Obama, you're in danger of being a dupe of that same ruling class that bought you Obama. You've got to understand it is the reversal of the ideological fields on the part of the ruling class that the average person can't keep up with. If you want to be a leader, you better learn to keep up with it. Now, let's get to Paul Ryan. The purpose of, we said Ron Paul, right? Ron Paul's candidacy is to make